Up next, we have Dr. Kamala Schelling and Stephanie Hendrix, our amazing teacher from Bangor, Maine, and they're going to share a smorgasbord of curriculum with you, which we like to call quick curriculum or quickulum. So here we go. Take it away, Dr. Schelling.
I want to just start as we move into this curriculum section. There's probably no really smooth way to do this, but I want to return to two things that Peter said when he was talking. First, about it, this quote was so incredible. It took an opera to create the space for people to come together and talk. And related, but slightly different significantly, using opera to create a protected space to share what we are really, really thinking about. So on the one hand, right, this is about using opera to tell students whatever it is that interests you, you can dig into this opera, and that thing that interests you is present, it's there, it's an important part of the opera, and your experience and your interests make the opera what the opera can be. These are all crucial elements of creating the final product. The whole, let's call it the Gesamtkunstwerk, not in the Wagnerian sense, but in the sense of we all come together, we all watch this, we have an experience, and that sum total of the experiences contributes to what the opera can be. So interdisciplinarity. And then two, creating a protected space to really express what we're thinking. We are all struggling right now. I love this question that Susan always asks, how are you doing really? And taking this opportunity to use opera as a space to say, what are you thinking really? What are you really interested in? Go do some research and come back and tell me what you found. Now, I'm going to take a little jaunt down the path of mundanity for the next 3 minutes and just show you in very concrete terms what we have. For those of you who are old hat at this program, for those of you who've been with us for 1 year or 10 years or even 14 years in some cases, you know all of this already, but I want people who are new to the program to have a really quick introduction and overview of the kinds of materials we make available. So with that in mind, I'm going to share my screen. This is the main Met Education website. If you go to metopera.org/education, it will redirect you to here. All you have to do is scroll down to HD Live in Schools, click on it. And as you scroll down, we have all of the operas for this year, all 10 of them organized by the units we've grouped them in. And all of the educator guides, as we complete them, will be published on this site. So if, for instance, you want to see the Akhenaten guide, which I just published it yesterday, we've updated it from last year. You click on it. You have a choice to read it as a PDF. Our graphic design team is incredible. They have put in so many beautiful images. It's a wonderful reading experience. However, if you're doing most of your reading online, if you want to be able to easily link to particular parts of the guide, or if it's easier for you to engage with this material through a screen reader, you have the entire thing. Every single word in this guide is available in HTML form by scrolling down below. It's organized into a bunch of nifty little pictures you can click on, find out more about the story. We have our who's who list. We have the essay telling you about the source. We have our activities philosophical chairs that Tim introduced us to last week, plus some active activities. That was a great phrase, active activities, but activities you can do. And then the various deep dives and special features and timelines and fun facts that you know and love from our guide are all available here. This whole site has been set up specifically so that a screen reader can navigate it easily. And we're so thrilled that we've been able to add that element of accessibility to our curricula. We also have, for people in the program, the first ever Met Live in HD Google Classroom, where with each opera, we've organized it. We only have 4 of them up here so far, but we've organized it according to opera. You simply click on Fidelio or Akhenaten or Dr. Atomic. It'll take you down to that collection of activities and every single thing you need for that activity, every single link, all the additional readings, all the videos we might want you to watch are all in this Google Classroom. This, of course, comes with the caveat that we are trying to create activities which are accessible to and appropriate for as wide a range of ages as possible. But that does mean that while a given activity can easily be aged up and down, not every single thing in the activity as it currently stands in this Google Classroom will be appropriate for every single student. So please, before you simply click assign, do take a minute to read through it. Do take a minute to click on the links we've included and decide what is the best thing for your classroom and your community and your students. So with that in mind, I want to think about three major topics that I pulled out of this conversation we just had with Peter Sellers. And for me, topic number one is the bomb as the sort of mythological force, even though it's very real, mythological in the sense that this is an object of creation and destruction. And this group of 20-something scientists, Oppenheimer was only in his 40s, are stationed in the middle of nowhere in the New Mexico desert, and they've been told to create something that could potentially destroy life as we know it. It was theorized. Some people suggested that maybe the Trinity test could ignite the Earth's atmosphere, and the Earth would literally just go up in a flame. It would destroy everything. So to think about these people who've been tasked with this project that could literally result in the destruction of everything. So that's one thing, these big issues of creation and destruction and what that means in a very real way for the people tasked with doing that and the people on whom the bomb is ultimately dropped. The second big takeaway was the relationship between poetry and humanities and then science and how they have to come together to tackle these cosmic questions. Again, Oppenheimer was a huge lover of poetry. I think he spoke and read like 5 languages. He read the Bhagavad Gita in Sanskrit. He read Baudelaire in French. He had these books in his pockets as he was creating this bomb. And then finally, the impact on the local populations, and especially the indigenous populations, and the ongoing impact of this warhead on populations that had traditionally been in the New Mexico desert around the area of Los Alamos, and then also even non-indigenous populations who are downwinder populations, and the ongoing effects of those tests still today, even though we're not currently exploding bombs in the Nevada desert, but people are still dying of cancers that can be linked to the literal fallout, not using fallout in a metaphorical sense here, but the literal fallout from those tests. So in a totally non-coincidental coincidence, we have 3 activities created by the amazing Miss Stephanie Hendrix that have specifically been designed to tie into these 3 elements. So Stephanie Hendrix, where are you? Dan, can I get you to highlight Stephanie?
There she is.
Hello.
Hello, Stephanie. I can't see on my, are you spotlit, Stephanie?
I'm here. Yep.
Beautiful. All right, then I'm going to kick this over to you and ask you to present these 3 activities.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I did prepare some slides for today, and I want to start by saying that I am joining you from the unceded ancestral lands of the Wabanaki people, specifically of the Penobscot Nation, the people of the Dawn. We call it Bangor, Maine, but that is not what they called it. And as we think about these lessons that I've designed for this opera, which really spoke to my soul, I tried to create them in such a way that they would empower students and build empathy. So these lessons ask them to consider motivation, perspective, responsibility. And for me as a teacher, these are urgent pedagogies for this moment. I loved in the interview when Peter Sellers talked about the weight of history. And for me, the big question is, or as I was designing these lessons, the big question was how through this art, through this opera, through these lessons, through the conversation, we can work to repair harm. And how we can work to empower students socially, emotionally, communally, to open their hearts and open their minds. And I was struck by another thing that Peter Sellers mentioned when he said that, you know, as we create things, we need to be dedicated to some larger purpose. And for me as a teacher, my larger purpose when I enter the classroom is to be in service of my students, because I am surrounded continually by their possibility and by their human potential. And I know that they are going to go on to create beautiful things. They are going to do things that will make my world a better place. And I am grateful for the opportunity to apprentice them in some ways to think about these big issues that are sort of going on in their art, in their lives, in their world. So that's where all of these lessons came from. And the lessons are as much about the opera as they are about the additional materials and resources that I've compiled to accompany them. So as you dig into the lessons, you'll find that each of them has a number of hyperlinks and videos and other resources and readings and perspectives that are designed to enhance students' experience of this amazing opera. And so it's not just about the thing that students are being asked to do, but it's also about all of the things that students are being asked to explore as they try to, you know, understand, analyze, open their minds and hearts to this, this opera. So 3 different activities that I'm going to talk about today. The first one I titled Anatomic Assemblage. Can you tell that I'm an English teacher as well as a historian? The second one called Batter My Heart. And then the third one is called The Cloudflower Blossoms. So I'll walk you through each of these 3 activities and some of the things that I've designed to go along with them and what students are being asked to do. And then I think we'll have an opportunity to go into breakout rooms and to maybe talk about or try some of these things out. So in the first one, Anatomic Assemblage, I was really inspired by the story of how the libretto for this opera was constructed. And part of this is to actually ask students to watch an excerpt of an interview with Peter Sellers as he speaks about his composition process. And the lesson asks students to use some of those same techniques to craft a found poem for 2 voices to describe the aftermath of the bomb's explosion. So a found poem is something that if you teach English language arts or in the humanities, you might be familiar with. If you have a speech team at your school, found poems are linked in some ways to the POI, the POI program for oral interpretation, which if you have students on speech teams that are working for that particular event, you might ask for their expertise or ask your speech teacher to come in and maybe talk a little bit about how this can work. But I sort of moved this activity beyond just the opera to consider not only those moments leading up to the detonation and leading up to the Trinity test, but also to the aftermath. And so in addition to creating this found poem, students are also going to learn about the after effects of the detonation of the atomic bombs, particularly in the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. In the interview clip, Peter Sellers talks about how some of the words in the libretto are designed to sing people's secrets into the world. And again, I think it's really important for students to understand that, you know, the words of the libretto were drawn from declassified government documents and personal papers and technical manuals and poems and all of this stuff, so that they can really think about how it was compiled. And students as they study the libretto, as they study the composition process, as they read the synopsis of the opera, they're going to ask some questions and do some reflection, and then we're going to move beyond the opera. And so I ask students to kind of experience a shift in perspective by reading John Hersey's interviews with people who survived the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. It's published, these interviews are published as a book, but they were also originally published in a periodical. They are all 100% available online. So students can decide which excerpts or which sections they want to read, or teachers can choose particular sections to assign to them. John Hersey, though, not Japanese. So after looking at some of those interviews, I wanted students to deepen their understanding of the implications of the bomb by examining memoirs and hibakusha poetry of Japanese survivors of the bombing. So we look at a collection of haiku written by Japanese women who survived the bombing. We look at a graphic novel adaptation, Barefoot Gen, well, it's technically manga, and it was made into an anime as well, that tells the story of somebody who survived the bombing. And I think that shift in perspective is really important, that we'll talk about the scientists and kind of the next activities, but really understanding, yes, this was an immense scientific achievement, but what are the implications for the people on whom this gadget was deployed, right? And then after students have done some of this investigation and looking at different source materials and different information, as they read, they're going to pull out evocative words and phrases and lines. And then their task is to arrange them poetically so that they reveal a new meaning. And that's how found poetry works. And so some of the example texts that I included for them to look at, again, the John Hersey Hiroshima piece, when you think about some of the lines that they could pull to create a found poem, there's a line right from the first section of this where Hersey is retelling this story, and he says, everything fell, collapsed in splinters. There in the tin factory, in the first moment of the atomic age, a human being was crushed by books. There's this really interesting juxtaposition of like past and present and the ushering in of the atomic age. And that's something that I think students could pull from and arrange poetically in interesting ways. They could combine it with some of these haiku by Japanese women that come from a collection called White Flash, Black Rain. This one spoke to my soul as a mother. Reality is this and only this, the one bone I place in the bent and burned small school lunch tin. Here's my 6-year-old to say hello to. And then another poem that I include, which I really love also, is from beat poet Gregory Corso. It's a poem called Bomb. It's a concrete poem, and the poem itself is shaped like a mushroom cloud. And the poem starts out by talking about the bomb as the budger of history, break of time, you bomb, toy of universe, grandest of all snatched sky. I cannot hate you. And there's something really powerful and interesting that happens over the course of that poem. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities for students to dig into these supplemental texts to help them understand the bigger context of what's going on in the opera, and then to create something in the same technique that Sellers used that presents a new perspective or creates a new meaning on what they have discovered through their exploration. So that's a little introduction to lesson 1. For lesson 2, we turn our focus to Oppenheimer himself. And this lesson is really about agency, responsibility, and ethics. And you know, really thinking about, in the interview we just heard, Peter Sellers asked, you know, to consider what are people going through. And this question of what is Oppenheimer going through, how does he wrestle with his responsibility as a scientist and as somebody who is charged with sort of discovering new things and trying to find answers to his questions, but also his responsibility as a human to the global community. And so this lesson sort of deals with that push and pull, that tension that happens in his character, right? So those are some of the big questions that they ask. We start really by looking at the synopsis of Dr. Atomic and by creating a character chart to look at the emotions, the reasons, the conflicts, the motivations that seem to be present in Oppenheimer's character in the opera. We move on in the next stage to study his aria at the end of Act 1, which we, heard right at the beginning of this section. An excerpt from the words of that are taken from John Donne's Holy Sonnet, "Batter my heart, three-personed God." And, if you happen to have a literature teacher who could come in to talk to your class, or if you happen to be a literature teacher, then you could totally geek out a little bit on sonnet form and all of the really masterful things that are happening in Donne's Holy Sonnet. But I think there are some bigger and more interesting questions that go on here because, Donne's Holy Sonnet makes the claim that in order to be made anew, in order to be saved by his God, he must be destroyed first. And I think that there's a parallel there to the atomic age, and there's a parallel there to ethical questions of agency and fate versus free will, right? Because if you allow yourself to be destroyed, if you give yourself over wholly to a deity who then sort of becomes in control, to what extent do you still have agency? To what extent do you still have responsibility for the choices you make and for the things that you're doing? And I think that is one of the central questions of that sonnet, of that aria, and of Oppenheimer's character in the opera. For stage 3 of this activity, students then get to look at some primary source materials, including some interviews with Oppenheimer, and really think about, how what happens in the opera is really sort of borne out by what happens in the historical record, or what they notice between those two things. And then lastly, we look at that excerpt from the Bhagavad Gita, where Oppenheimer claims on the first detonation of the bomb, he says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He says, "I supposed we all felt that one way or another." And again, I think that sort of gets at this tension between his duty as a scientist and his duty to humanity. All of these activities sort of build up to asking students to create something that visually represents what's going on in Oppenheimer's heart, in his mind, in his character, with regard to motivations. And what that can look like is something like this. So these are representations that my students created that really sort of use visual symbolism in much the same way that the source texts, like in the Bhagavad Gita or in Donne's Holy Sonnet, rely on metaphor to sort of represent these internal and external forces acting on Oppenheimer, both as a human and as a scientist. So there's another sort of element of creation happening here for students as they're trying to use some of the same tools of metaphor and symbolism to try to find a way to represent what that struggle is for Oppenheimer as he makes his way toward that initial detonation at Trinity. And then last but not least, lesson 3 is called The Cloudflower Blossoms. And for lesson 3, I really wanted to focus on issues related to the indigenous people and to issues related to Pascualita as a character in particular. And so this activity asks students to explore the indigenous characters and indigenous representation in Dr. Atomic, and it asks them to learn a little bit about the history of indigenous people living in or near the Trinity test site. And not only that, but to create a plan that will help them learn more about the Indigenous peoples living in their area. And I think there are a lot of opportunities here as well to think about the nature, the earth, the opera, and researching some of these local connections in ways that are meaningful for students and their communities. So the first thing we do is sort of think about nature and earth and how that's represented in the opera. There's this really interesting thing that happens with the weather report and the way that the thunder and lightning storm is happening, and then the detonation of the test. And I've created this really cool thing. I'll come back to the slide in a minute, but there's this really interesting comparison activity where students watch a video of thunder and lightning storms over the Nevada desert, and then they watch the video of the detonation of the Trinity test, and they look at the song that Pascualita sings about the cloud flower blossoming, and really sort of pay attention to the imagery that connects both of those things, and thinking about setting and nature and how that works in the opera. I also ask students to think about how Pascualita and her people are represented in the opera. There's this really amazing scene in the stage design where you have Pascualita, and then she's surrounded by other Indigenous people, and they're sort of up on higher levels looking down on the scientists that are engaging in this test. And so asking students to do a close reading of that scene and the staging of that scene, and to really think about what's being communicated there. And then students also get a chance to look at some of the accounts of the downwinders, and to some of the contemporary accounts of Indigenous people who have been affected by these detonations, and to learn about what Indigenous people have to say. So one of the downwinders, she ends her interview with NPR that I've linked as one of the resources for students to look at. She says, "We're still going to be here no matter what happens, and our tradition, our songs, our dances are going to live on forever." And I think that's an important thing to think about, because I know a lot of students, at least my students, get really surprised when they find out that there are still real life Indigenous people, despite the fact that we live only a few miles from Indian Island, which is a reservation in my area in Bangor, Maine. Students have this sort of weird understanding that Indigenous ways of life are the past, not the present, and definitely not the future. And so the research that students are asked to do helps them sort of move that in the future, and helps them connect it to their local communities. So those are the 3 lessons that I've designed. One of them really about the structure and the writing process behind the opera's libretto. One of them really looking at character motivation and thinking about scientific ethics and how those play out in the opera. And then one of them asking students to create original inquiry questions and to do some inquiry-driven research about Indigenous issues, to really pay attention to how the Trinity test affected Indigenous peoples. Those are the 3 lessons. That's what I've designed, and I hope that there's some time to maybe dig into those a little bit more, and to think about what's happening. I'm happy for folks to reach out to me by email if you need other resources or anything. I'm happy to help in whatever way I can. Thank you.